Mackey, and I am the Publications Manager at the Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. And today I'm speaking with Zhou Xueguang, who is the Guoding Li Professor in Economic Development, a Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and a Professor of Sociology at Stanford University. Professor Zhou has written extensively on China's governance and bureaucracy in both Chinese and English. And today we're here to talk about his new book, The Logic of Governance in China, published by Cambridge University Press. It's based on his previous book in Chinese, published by Sanlian Shudian in 2017, but revised and rewritten into English. He's currently in Beijing, and you spent, I think, the first half of your sabbatical doing research in Hong Kong.
Yes.
So Professor Zhou, it's great to see you again. We haven't seen each other for about 3 years. Thanks for taking time off your busy schedule to talk about your book.
Nice to see you, George.
As you note in your preface, you've been working on this research since about 2004. In fact, I distinctly remember in about 2006, when I met you at Stanford, asking you what you worked on, and you said the Chinese bureaucracy. And I think maybe it was a failure of my own imagination and the fact that I don't have a background in sociology, but I really couldn't imagine what that meant. But it turns out, after reading your book, it goes into very, very interesting territory. Could you talk about what inspired you to spend so much time and work and energy on this topic? And if you could explain your central thesis in the book for us?
I guess in my first decade of my academic career, I mostly focused on quantitative research on China in the area of economic sociology, social inequality. And so as I try to move on with my new research program, I was thinking about doing a field work because at that time, this is in the mid 2000s, China has been undergoing tremendous changes, and I would just feel like out of touch with what was going on there. And then I was in Hong Kong at that time. The physical proximity gave me a convenience to conduct my field work. So by accident, I came to this township in northern China and started my field work that lasted for more than 10 years. So I went back to this place every year, several times each year, and each time I will stay there for a week or sometimes several weeks, an entire summer there. In this process, I learned a great deal about how organizations operate at the local level, especially the Chinese bureaucracy, local cadres, how they respond to top-down policy implementation, and also solving local problems. So from there, actually, I was looking upwards, really a bottom-up kind of approaches to understand how China has been governed by the macro policies, but implemented through local bureaucrats and local officials, and interacting with the villagers, the village cadres, and so on and so forth. So it's a tremendous journey of learning experience for me.
Broadly speaking, you talk about the tension between the central government and the local government and how that creates a whole series of processes and behaviors. Could you explain a little bit about that and about the different models that you came up with?
So, throughout this really long process of understanding what was going on, and in that, even though it's a relatively small area, it's one township with about 27 villages, but really encountered a wide range of issues. For example, village elections, where you see the central government policies and local bureaucrats, and also villagers who try to find their voice in these election processes, interact in a very intensive way. Also evolved over time. When I first came to this township, the election process is more or less like a formality. It's not seriously implemented, and mostly it's controlled or manipulated by local bureaucrats. But gradually, you do see changes, and that really says a lot about the underlying processes of what we are interested in. Institutional changes in China. Focus on that case allows me to really understand how central government, local bureaucrats, and also the villagers interact. Then, of course, there are other instances. For example, another example in my book is about public good provision in the so-called Road to Every Village project, where the government supplies some kind of funding for villagers to build their own roads leading to the economic center of that region. It turns out it's really interesting. Another dynamic between state policies, local bureaucrats, and also village collective, how they interact to get things done, but also in that process accumulated huge public debts, collective debts that led to a lot of consequences. So really understanding this, grassroots level, how people respond to policies and how that policy implementation changes their collective, their social relations, and that has huge consequences for us to really better understand how China has evolved over time. And that's, the bottom-up processes, to me, is one thing that has been missing in our understanding of China. And, most of the time, we focus on a top-down process. We think about how big policies were made in Beijing and how these, things are very effective policy implementation by the bureaucrats. But if you look at local level, there are really many different dynamics that we need to understand.
You told quite a story in that chapter, and you were very tricky. You set the reader up to expect something with Mr. Kang and Mr. Long. Mr. Kang, this dynamic entrepreneurial guy, and I think he was the village head for Uphill Village, I think it was called.
Right. Yeah.
And then Mr. Long, this beaten down, tired guy. He didn't even want the job. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. But in the end, things didn't turn out the way we thought they would. They were quite reversed.
Yeah, to be honest, when I tracked these processes, I was surprised to me too. This is really something, this says a lot about how to understand policy implementations in a society. Formally, you see very authoritarian bureaucratic implementation processes, but in reality, things can go in very different directions, involving very different dynamics.
So that was your chapter entitled The Road to Collective Debt. Related to that, one of the concepts you talk about is something called inverted soft budget budget constraints. Explain that, because it's kind of, the basic fact is very astounding if someone who's not familiar with the concept.
The concept of soft budget constraint was one of the central concepts analyzing formal Soviet-style socialist economy developed by economist Kornai. And so the idea there is that in a socialist economy, even the planned economy, there's simply no hard budget constraint because all the factories, all the companies are owned by the state. So the companies, when they incur debts, when they incur whatever economic problems, and then the government have to come to the rescue, so that the budget never be hardened to constrain their behaviors. So that they give a different incentive for companies to overgrow, overdevelop, overproduce, and also uneven production processes. So things like that. So the idea in that concept is upward demanding for new resources. So that's called soft budget constraint. What I observed in Chinese context during the reform era is that local authorities, local governments, instead of asking upwards for more resources, they move downwards to the companies, the residents, the citizens within their jurisdiction to demand to extract more resources so that they can mobilize resources to achieve whatever goals, policy goals, and also political achievement. That's what the term we called 政绩. So that's why I thought about relating to this previous description of the patterns of behaviors of these former Soviet societies. And now I want to put it in a different context, in a Chinese reform context. And the relationship or the direction of the extracting resources is reversed. That's why I call it inverted soft budget constraint.
Yeah, it's remarkable because there's all these projects where there's a mandate from the central government. It gets down to the local level. They have to find a way to implement them.
Exactly.
But they're unfunded or largely unfunded. For example, in the paved road project, I think you said something like the central government was supplying 70,000 renminbi for each kilometer of road, when in fact the cost to build the road was 240,000 renminbi per kilometer. So, and some of the strategies that local governments use, fines, they can't create taxes, but they can, create fees. And then another one you mentioned was to get a private enterprise to contribute.
Underwrite the project.
Yeah, to underwrite the project. Yeah,
yeah,
really...
that's quite often. So-called public financing actually is mobilizing resources, especially for private companies, because there are a lot of behind-the-table dealings, right? If you support my public project this time, next time I'll give you some privileged access to whatever other resources that the government can deliver to you. Yeah, so a lot of things going on in that context. I think that's one of the key issues to understand, the energy behind the Chinese economy, right? It's not the government does a lot of things. It's government make use of private entrepreneurs and other companies to participate in this kind of public project financing and investment and also development.
In concept, it can be a great idea, but I guess it doesn't work. It doesn't always pan out that way.
Certainly, in many ways, you think about private entrepreneurs. The villagers, they of course want to live in a more certain environment where if you want some project get done, there's well financed, right? Otherwise, you have to try so hard. Like these two villages I talk about in my book, they literally just incur huge debt to get this done, and in the end, they have to shoulder all the burdens, all the pressures to repay the debts, and that's it's a pretty hard experience for them.
Another great case study you did is on environmental regulation. You talked about the central government's 5-year plan to reduce sulfur dioxide and what was it, COD? I can't remember what that was.
Yeah.
It was something related to water pollution, right? Can you talk about some of the strategies that when you get down to the provincial and municipal and village levels, how they manage to meet the central government's mandates?
That's really a fascinating story. It took us, first of all, let me say, when I say us, the field work was conducted by actually a PhD student I directed in China. He's a graduate student in Beijing. And so he went to this Environmental Protection Bureau and basically stayed there for over a 3-year period of time. Each summer, he went there and worked in the offices, just literally just 24 hours. He's there to observe, to participate, and also get to know people there. So he accumulated a huge amount of observations, data. What we found is very, very interesting. One of the things you mentioned, that people manipulate data, people allocate performance, measure good performance, more or less almost like arbitrarily. That's really puzzling. It also seems like the government is totally irrational. It took us a long while to figure out what is the rationale behind that. And so we wrote several papers, eventually came into part of the several chapters of that book. One of the key issues here, what I called, we developed a control theory, a control right theory. A control right theory basically says that actually government, if we look at government at 3 levels, the central government, the mid-level government, like the provincial government, or the municipal government, and also the lower level we call agent, right? So you have principal, you have the management, then you have the agent by which we meant the county level environmental protection agencies. If you look at how these different levels of authority allocate their decision rights, and some of these decision rights, the higher level keep in their hands, like inspection, like setting up goals, but they lack other decision rights to the lower levels, such as incentives, giving out incentives, or how to implement concrete task performance. So what happened is that the lower level, the mid-level management, actually, because they have the decision rights to reallocate resources and to implement whatever policies according to what they see as priorities. In that sense, they actually have the decision rights to either reward people or not rewarding people because they have better information. So apparently, you have like mid-level government arbitrarily reallocate all these performance measures and outcomes. But in fact, they are doing actually a good job in the sense they know who is actually not doing good job, but because they have better environment, less demand for their pollution solution. So in a sense, they are doing actually according to their decision rights. They are using their, say, exercise their incentives to motivate people at lower levels. So we developed that theory to try to explain why governments actually shift into different modes, sometimes tightly coupled, sometimes become loosely coupled, and sometimes they become, sometimes even the federalist style kind of management. In different modes, then the incentive to the rights to motivate people to implement policies varies depending on different circumstances. And so if you put in that context, we can better understand why, for example, they distort data under certain conditions, why they actually allocate performance achievement to some other agents.
This is a good little kind of microcosm of what your whole book was about. You saw a situation that didn't make sense or was puzzling, and you figured out what the logic was.
Yeah, I think the key contribution of that study is that a lot of apparently contradictory kind of cases, behaviors. Actually, if we look closely, we can theorize and talk about the rationales behind why they behave this way. And under different circumstances, they behave different ways. And that actually gives us a better understanding of why Chinese government actually can shift to different modes of government, different mode of public administration.
I'm reminded of one of the things you point out about bureaucrats. It's tough. You figured out that they have about 3 years in order to make an impact and to move up the ladder. And otherwise, they're not going to make it.
Actually, that's an interesting observation. But even more remarkable is that if we look at history from the Ming Dynasty, this was about several hundred years ago. I mean, there are historians who studied how the chief officials in different counties or prefectures and their duration of their tenure duration. It turns out since Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, and now the People's Republic era, on average, chief officials, their tenure duration is about 3 years. It's a remarkable stable. There must be some good reason for it.
It's so weird to think. We think things are so different now. This Leninist party structure, and yet stuff like that stays exactly the same.
But I think that's one of the key points I want to make in that book. That is, there's a historical continuity. A lot of things, the tension between, what I call the fundamental tension between centralization of authority and effectiveness in local governance. These are things have stayed there forever. And so whatever new government comes in, they have to address this fundamental tension. And the strategies turn out to be more or less similar over time.
You have these great case studies, and then your book shifts to this chapter on unorganized interest and collective action. Why was that important to put in this book?
So the book basically is organized around two themes. One theme is the interaction between central and local governments, between the state and the bureaucracy. And the second theme is the interaction between the state and the society. So this theme, the unorganized interests and collective action, fits the second theme. That is under this kind of institutional arrangements, what we see in China, and how individuals, social groups respond to these authoritarian rules, right? Previously, people think about, because the state is so strong and organizationally, it does not give any room for collective action. So we would not expect formally organized collective action, which is pretty much true. But we do observe collective action occurred from time to time, sometimes even large scale. And so we need an explanation. And the explanation I offered, and actually I wrote this chapter of this article on which this chapter is based actually a long time ago, try to think about why there are similar large-scale collective actions in different places, even under very tightly controlled authoritarian state. And so what my argument is that because the state imposes similar conditions on the residents, social groups, and reduce them to pretty much at same status, same level. So they cultivate similar grievances. And also the way they organize people, also the way they implement policies, provide kind of opportunities for individuals and social groups to participate and therefore give them a chance to file their grievances. And sometimes this kind of things erupt into public open protest or hidden protest, in many ways, what I call collective inaction.
Yeah, I was thinking about this in terms of the COVID policy in China, and we know that there's some current unrest revolving around that. And I was thinking about how this fits into your model that you introduced in the beginning. And I was thinking, well, local implementation seems to be following central mandate perfectly. So doesn't that kind of go against a lot of the stuff you've talked about? And then it occurred to me, one of your key points is that campaign style mobilization. That's the central government's response when things get too loose at the local level, and there's nervousness about whether they're following the mandates of the central government. And we've seen these campaign style mobilizations take place in China over the decades. Has the COVID policy at this point become a kind of campaign style mobilization?
Oh, it has been for a long time. I think in the last few decades, campaign style mobilization has been one of the most effective ways of mobilizing resources and get things done by the central government and by local government as well. So this is almost like a routine style policy instruments. But what happened is that during this campaign style mobilization, you get people involved, you mounted tremendous pressures for get things done. But sometimes you have to step overboard. And this COVID pandemic response is a very good example of this. When the government from top down exerts this campaign style mobilization at different levels of the local governments, they try to implement, and they try to implement in a very strict manner so that they can avoid any problems that they have to shoulder the responsibilities. That has triggered a lot of resentment, cultivate a lot of grievances all over the place. So even though exactly because the policy was started at the very top and implemented through campaign style mobilization all over the place, so they cultivate similar grievances, and that's why whenever there's a chance for people to voice their grievances, they erupted all over the place. So that really fit my argument quite well.
It really, everyone's been put in the same exact terrible situation, and they're speaking up about it. You talk about the charismatic leader. Your implication is that the very structure of China's government actually produces the need for a charismatic leader. You say, I think, that charismatic leadership is essential to the legitimacy of the Chinese state. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean there?
Indeed, I think charismatic leadership has been central to the Chinese governance, not only for the Communist Party, but even before that, under the empire, the Chinese empire, the emperor actually has this kind of what called the son of heaven, right? It's connected with some kind of superhuman power. Obviously, after 1949, Mao Zedong became this charismatic leader. And he also made a very conscious effort to what Max Weber, who first developed this concept of a charismatic authority, also says that gradually the charismatic leader may want to transfer this kind of charisma to the institution. So he's trying to, or Mao Zedong is trying to also build up the charismatic authority of the Communist Party. So the charisma of office or charisma of institutions. So that has been there all these years, okay? But during the early phase of the reform and openness era, when the government become decentralized, local governments try to strive for their own economic development, the charismatic leadership is not as relevant. So I thought, just like you, that this power will have moved beyond this era. But clearly, in the last decade also, we clearly see the revival of the charismatic leadership is trying to rebuild the charisma of the top leaders and try to also re-centralize in the hand of the Communist Party. And that, of course, revived the need for charisma because they have to build legitimacy, why we should listen to and put all our power and this authority into the hand of one person or the ruling party. That's because they know all. They have the mighty power to do all the right things. So that's the basis of charismatic authority. Unfortunately, I think China returned to an era, or probably just continued the era of still relying heavily on charismatic leadership for their legitimacy and for survival.
I want to ask you one more thing before we go, and I want to keep you too long. And again, in your preface of your book, you note that your 2017 book in Chinese, after its first printing of, I think you said 7,000 or 9,000 copies, it was unshelved. What exactly does that mean?
That's a term actually in Chinese called 下架, meaning take away from circulation and from public display. Basically try to put it away, but it's not like denounced, criticized. Basically let it disappear. So that's, I think, a new term.
Disappearing is sometimes worse than being criticized, because no one knows, right?
Yeah. So what happened is that after, I think the first print is about I think 7,000 volume, and I think they sold out within about 2 or 3 months. Actually, they contact me and say they are going to issue the second printing and ask me, if there's any revisions, there are corrections. There are several, misprints or
Typos.
Yeah, typos. Yeah, things like that. But then I received words that this is actually interesting. That it's not formal, it's not written, but they received words from a higher level that this book cannot be reprinted. Whatever already in the market, in the circulation, should be taken back. So that's what we call unshelved. So that's the what happened after the first few months. It is in the market, then it disappeared. And now what happened is that after that, of course, we have a contract. The contract says that the contract stipulates that if there's a market need, they will reprint the book. And when they say they cannot reprint it, and they return the copyright to me. And once I have the copyright, I put the electronic copy, the PDF, on my website. And so people can freely download and read. I think a lot of copies have been downloaded from there.
That's great. Do you have any thoughts on what it was precisely?
Yeah, my best guess is this. I think from whatever the public censorship point of view, this book has exposed some of the inner mechanisms, processes of how the Chinese governance works. And for charismatic leaders, you don't want people to know how it really actually worked. You want people just worship you, just think, you know all, you can do everything right. And I think for that reason, they feel this very uneasy, probably undermines their authority. In the Western society, there's always, Max Weber talks about this disenchantment processes, rationalization, disenchantment. I think, China also is, in the reform era, has been undergoing this process of disenchantment. So we talk about why in the past, why China fall behind, and how people should use modern technologies and modern human spirits to revive the energies among the Chinese people. So in many ways, this book is contributing to that disenchantment process. And that's probably a threat to the charismatic leaders and also the Leninist party, the very foundation of that party governance.
So interesting. Professor Zhou, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I wish you luck with the rest of your quarantine. And I hope we can meet up sometime in the future if I can get back to California.
Yes. Thank you very much, George.